We are talking about the most famous, the most storied, the most legendary, if you will, projects in Hollywood that never happened.
All right.
Kevin Smith, as you live and breathe, almost made a Superman movie, and it was called Superman Lives, or originally
And it died. And that's kind of what it's about, right? He dies, but then he lives. And they're like, all right, let's go with that.
You know, there's a million fine-looking women in the world, dude, but they don't all bring you lasagna at work.
This was mid-90s, obviously post-Clerks, post-Mallrats. Like, tell us exactly where you were, at what point in your career, time in your life, like when this opportunity first came your way.
I had just picked up a new agent, Phil Raskin, and Phil Raskin was like, Basil Iwanyk wants to meet with you. He liked the Chasing Amy script, so he wants to talk to you about working on Warner Brothers scripts. They gave me a script to read called The Architects of Fear, which was based on an Outer Limits episode. And I thought it was one of the best scripts I'd ever read in my life. He also said, we're working on Superman. I was like, Superman? And he's like, yeah, but like, it'd be a long shot for you on that. He's going, that's kind of big project. And I was like, can I at least read it? And he was like, yeah, I'll give you a copy. And so he gave me a copy to take home and read. I read it and he brought me back in for a meeting to talk about Architects of Fear. And I said, but can we talk about Superman? And he said, yeah, what'd you think? And I was like, it's terrible. And he was like, excuse me? I was like, oh my God, it's terrible. Like the whole script, like it doesn't, the people who wrote it don't understand Superman at all. Like it's kind of like winking and stuff like that. Like there's a way faithful telling of this to do. Audience appreciates it being treated seriously and stuff like that. And he was like, go on. And I told him what I thought was wrong with it. And then he goes, let's go talk to this guy. Eventually I got to the head of the studio, Lorenzo Di Bonaventura, the Transformers man. But he was running Warner Brothers back then. So like, tell him what you told us about Superman. And I tell him. And then Lorenzo goes, well, what would you do different? And I was like, oh, well, I think you could do this. And then after that, he was like, all right, well, you're hired. Go do it. I was like, do I start now? And they're like, first you got to go talk to Jon Peters. And I was like, okay. And I knew who Jon Peters was because my mom was a big Barbra Streisand fan. And he used to date Barbra Streisand. He was Barbra Streisand's hairdresser. Then he became a producer because he produced The Main Event movie she was in and stuff. They dated. So I go pitch to Jon Peters and he lives in this like gigantic house. He was like, tell me what you were thinking about Superman. And so I was like, all right. And I pitched him my idea for what I wanted to do for what would eventually be Superman Lives. And Jon Peters goes, I'll never forget, he goes, you and me, we're going to make a great Superman. He goes, you want to know why? And I was like, why? And he goes, because you and me, we're from the streets. We understand Superman. And I'm like, Superman's not from the street. He's from Krypton. I'm thinking in my head. And I was like, you know, I'm from the suburbs. You were a hairdresser. Neither of us are from the streets. He was an interesting character, man. And whenever I would write a draft, an outline, or a draft of the script, I'd eventually have to go back to John's place and read it to him. And I was like, can he not read? I asked the assistant. They're like, no, he just likes to visualize while it's going on. So he would lay down on his couch, no bullshit, and he would go like this. Go.
You had story time.
He would build a little screen with his hands and look up at the ceiling and then tell me to go. And so he'd be seeing the movie as I read the movie out loud and stuff. He was the guy who insisted on a giant spider in the third act. He had gone to his kid's open house and the teacher that day was talking about spiders are the fiercest killers in the insect kingdom. So he was like, I want Superman fighting a giant spider. His inspiration was King Kong. He's like, when I was a kid and I saw King Kong and they opened those gates for the first time and you see him, that's what I want. So there were weird parameters. John also said, he's going like, I don't want to see him in that suit. It's too pink and I don't want to see him fly. And I was like, I said, why not fly? He goes, that flying looks cheap to me. And I was like, all right, but that suit and him flying, those are like the two things that really define the character. Like you ask anybody, they'll tell you, oh, his suit and he flies. But for me, it was the fun of like, all right, I'm going to make it work. Like, because I always had the ability to walk away from it at the end of the day. I was never going to direct this thing. So I could be like, Superman moves a mountain. Not my problem. They'll figure it out. So whatever they threw at me, I was like, great. As long as I can make it work in my head and heart, as a comic book fan, you know, I could kind of go with it and stuff.
Peters, from what I've heard, wanted Sean Penn for the role after seeing Dead Man Walking. Did you guys actually ever talk to Sean Penn about this?
No, I was, you know, he was, that was the first meeting I ever had with Peters. I was like, who do you see playing Superman? And he goes, if I had to cast it right now, Sean Penn. And, it was, just after Dead Man Walking. I was like, really? Sean Penn? And he's like, yeah, did you see his eyes in Dead Man Walking? Did you see Dead Man Walking? I said, yeah. He goes, look in his eyes in that movie. He's a haunted eyes, the eyes of a killer. And I was like, dude, it's Superman, like, that's not how most people think of Superman. He never said, I'm gonna, let's call him or anything like that. He was still way far out. And I guarantee you, Warner Brothers would have pushed back on that in a big bad way. He wanted to reinvent it. He wanted something gritty, graphic, and grown up. He essentially wanted like what Zack Snyder eventually did.
Next time they shine your light in the sky, don't go to it. The bat is dead.
I was writing it for Affleck. It was very Mallrats inspired because my Lex Luthor was Michael Rooker and my Superman was Ben. Because I was like, oh my God, like Ben was heating up. He already had, I think he'd been hired for Armageddon. So I was like, it could be that he'll be a legit movie star. He's got dark hair. I'm that uncreative where I'm like, Ben's got dark hair. Superman has dark hair. Ben's tall. That was the thing. Like Affleck, I guess people may notice from pictures, but he's a giant. He's built like a he's built like a giant action figure, particularly with the height. And then he puts on the muscles there too. So in my head and heart, it was always Ben and Michael Rooker, which was a weird like Mallrats reunion.
You're dead, Mallrat.
Was there ever sort of a memo to you that you were no longer involved? I mean, I know how tricky Hollywood can be in that regard, or does it just sort of go away? Like how did you leave this project?
You go from being the most important person in the world to just out of the loop, just like that. And so I remember I was doing a press tour for Chasing Amy. And so it was going to be opening in that market fairly soon. So I was in Connecticut doing press and my agent called me and he was like, we were talking about things and I was like, when do I have to submit another Superman draft? And he goes, you're done. You did your 2 drafts and they're not bringing you back. Tim's bringing on somebody else. And I was like, oh, all right. And, I wasn't like sad. And they spent so much money. Like they honestly spent between 25 and $50 million developing a movie that never happened. So like all the scripts that they paid to write, because there were many writers before me and there were writers after me. Tim and Nick, I think, were pay or play. When they pulled the plug on that movie, those guys got their full salaries, if I remember correctly. So much money was already on the books for Superman by the time they made the Bryan Singer version. So that got added to their budget as well in terms of money that had to be recouped for a Superman project.
And Peters ended up making some Superman movies. He was a producer, I think, with Snyder and Nolan, correct?
If it was, he didn't have any involvement. Like, I'm sure his name was on the Bryan Singer version.
Yeah.
And I'm sure his name might have been on all of them, but like he was then kind of distanced from the.
Well, there's a story. I don't know the details of it, but there's a tidbit out there that he was on Man of Steel and then Nolan kicked him off.
I'm not sitting here going, that could never happen. Like, that tracks.